Camp Alva, Oklahoma, August 1943. The barracks inspection was routine. Dr. Samuel Hartman walked through wooden buildings checking for sanitation violations, vermin infestations, anything that might threaten prisoner health. He had conducted 43 such inspections in 6 weeks. This one should have been the 44th. But when he entered Barrack 7 and saw what the prisoners were hiding beneath loose floorboards, his clipboard clattered to the floor. His hands stopped moving. His breath caught. The guards behind him asked what was wrong. Hartman couldn't answer. He was staring at something that shouldn't exist in an American POW camp, something that proved everything he believed about proper detention was dangerously, catastrophically wrong. Samuel Hartman was 52 years old when the war reached him. He had spent 26 years practicing internal medicine in Chicago, building a respected practice that served German-American neighborhoods on the city's north side. He spoke fluent German. His parents had immigrated in 1889 and understood the cultural nuances that made his patients comfortable seeking care. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Hartman volunteered for the medical corps despite his age. They assigned him to Camp Alva, a newly constructed POW facility in northwest Oklahoma, designed to hold 5,000 German prisoners captured in North Africa. The camp sprawled across flat prairie grassland, a grid of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers, the whole compound baking under skies so vast they made men feel small. Hartman's duties were straightforward: maintain prisoner health, prevent disease outbreaks, ensure sanitation standards met Geneva Convention requirements. It was unglamorous work, far from the battlefield medicine he had imagined when volunteering, but it was necessary. Epidemic disease in a POW camp could devastate both prisoners and guards, could create diplomatic incidents, could undermine America's claim to humane treatment of captured enemies. So he conducted his inspections methodically. Every barrack, every mess hall, every latrine, checking for proper waste disposal, adequate ventilation, clean water sources, looking for the early signs of illness, coughing patterns that suggested tuberculosis, skin conditions indicating nutritional deficiencies, behavioral changes hinting at mental deterioration. The prisoners learned to expect him, Dr. Hartman, the American who spoke German like their grandfathers, who asked about symptoms with genuine concern, who treated their medical complaints without prejudice or delay. Some viewed him with suspicion. He was still the enemy, still part of the machinery holding them captive. But most came to trust him, or at least to accept his presence as one of the more benign aspects of camp life. He thought he understood the camp completely. He was wrong. August 14, 1943. Temperature at noon reached 102 degrees, heat that turned metal surfaces untouchable and made afternoon inspections a test of endurance. Hartman waited until 3 p.m., when the sun's angle provided some relief, before beginning his rounds through the western section of the camp. Barrack 7 housed 60 prisoners, a mix of Wehrmacht enlisted men and Afrika Korps veterans captured during the Tunisia campaign. Hartman had inspected it twice before, found nothing concerning either time. Standard layout: double-stacked bunks along both walls, a wood stove at the center for winter heating, small windows providing minimal ventilation. Clean by POW standards. No obvious violations. He entered with 2 guards, Corporal Hayes from Texas and Private Johnson from Iowa, both young men assigned to escort duty because they showed no particular talent for anything else. The prisoners inside stood when Hartman entered, a gesture of respect or protocol, or simply habit from military training. He nodded acknowledgement and began his inspection. He checked the bunks first, looking for bedbugs or lice. Nothing. Examined the floor for pooled water that might breed mosquitoes. Nothing. Opened the stove to ensure the flue wasn't blocked. Clean. He was preparing to sign off on the inspection when he noticed something odd. A loose floorboard near the back corner. Just one board, its nail heads slightly raised, as if it had been pried up and replaced multiple times. In itself, this wasn't remarkable. Old buildings had loose boards. But something about the prisoner's body language made Hartman pause. They were watching him too carefully, tension radiating from their stillness. Watching to see if he would notice, what he would do if he did. Hartman walked toward the loose board slowly, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The prisoners didn't move, but their collective attention focused on him with an intensity that made the air feel charged. "Open it," Hartman said in German, pointing at the board. No one moved. "I said open it." A prisoner stepped forward. Obergefreiter Karl Schneider, 34 years old, captured at Kasserine Pass, leader of this particular barrack group. He knelt and pried up the board with careful hands. Beneath it, the space between floor joists was perhaps 18 inches deep. Inside that space, rats. Not dead rats, which might have suggested a pest control problem. Living rats. 3 of them, huddled in a nest made from scraps of cloth and paper. They were thin, clearly malnourished, their fur patchy and dull. But they were alive, and someone had been keeping them alive deliberately. Hartman stared. Behind him, Corporal Hayes made a disgusted sound. "Jesus Christ, they're keeping rats under the floor. That's a health violation right there. Doc, major sanitation problem." But Hartman was already connecting the pieces, already understanding what the rats represented. He looked at Karl Schneider, whose expression showed resignation mixed with defiance. "How long?" Hartman asked quietly in German. 6 weeks, Karl said. "Why?" Karl's jaw tightened. "Because we are hungry." The words landed like a physical blow. Hartman's hands went still. His clipboard hung forgotten at his side. For perhaps 10 seconds, he simply stood there, processing the implication of what he had discovered. The prisoners were so hungry, they were catching and keeping rats as supplemental food. Hartman ordered everyone out of the barrack except Karl Schneider. The other prisoners filed outside with obvious reluctance, leaving their spokesman to face consequences alone. The guards remained near the door, far enough to give privacy, but close enough to intervene if necessary. "Sit down," Hartman said, gesturing to a bunk. Karl sat, his posture military straight, despite the informal setting. Hartman remained standing, partly because sitting suggested comfort he didn't feel, partly because he needed the psychological distance that height provided. "Explain," Hartman said. Karl chose his words carefully, speaking German with the precision of someone addressing a superior officer. "The rations are insufficient. The camp provides what is mandated by Geneva Convention. We know this. We have no complaints about violations. But the quantities are calculated for average men doing average work. We are not average." "What do you mean?" "We work 10 hours daily in the fields. Cotton picking, sugar beet harvesting, whatever the local farms need. The work is hard, physical labor under this sun." Karl gestured toward the window, where August heat shimmered across the compound. "The rations are adequate for men sitting idle in a camp. They are not adequate for men doing agricultural labor. We are constantly hungry. We lose weight. Some men are developing symptoms of malnutrition." Hartman felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had approved those rations himself, calculating caloric needs based on standard military nutrition requirements. But Karl was right. The calculations assumed minimal physical activity, not 10 hours of farm labor in Oklahoma heat. "Why didn't you report this through official channels?" Hartman asked. "Request increased rations?" Karl's expression flickered with something like pity for Hartman's naivete. "We did, multiple times. The camp commander says the rations meet Geneva Convention standards. He says requests for additional food are attempts to exploit American generosity. He says German soldiers should be grateful to receive anything at all. So you caught rats. We supplement where possible. Rats, sometimes birds. Once, a rabbit that wandered too close to the fence. We are not complaining about our treatment. We understand we are prisoners." But we are also human beings who need adequate food to survive the work we are required to perform. Hartman sat down slowly on the opposite bunk. His medical training was screaming at him malnutrition in a POW population meant disease susceptibility, reduced healing capacity, psychological deterioration. It meant he had failed in his fundamental duty to maintain prisoner health. How many others? He asked quietly. How many other barracks are doing this? All of them, Carl said. Everyone who works in the fields. We catch what we can, we share what we catch. It is necessary. Hartman spent the next 4 hours conducting medical examinations that should have been done weeks earlier. He weighed prisoners, measured body composition, checked for signs of nutritional deficiency, brittle nails, thinning hair, deteriorating dental health, the subtle indicators of bodies consuming themselves when external nutrition proved inadequate. The data was damning. The average prisoner had lost between 15 and 20 pounds since arriving at Camp Alva. Some had lost more. Their body mass indexes were dropping into ranges that indicated chronic malnutrition. Several showed early signs of scurvy, despite the camp's provision of minimal vegetables. Others exhibited symptoms suggesting vitamin B deficiency, nerve problems, confusion, the beginnings of beriberi. They were starving. Slowly and visibly, but definitely starving. Hartman compiled his findings in a report that evening, sitting in his small office while the camp settled into night routines. His handwriting was usually neat, physician precise. Tonight it was shaky, letters forming with uncertain strokes that reflected his internal turmoil. He had prided himself on running a humane camp medical program, had believed that American treatment of POWs represented moral superiority over enemy practices, had told himself that the prisoners under his care received adequate treatment, that their health was being properly maintained. But he had been measuring the wrong things, checking for epidemic disease while missing the slow starvation happening under his supervision, following regulations without questioning whether those regulations were adequate for actual circumstances. The rats under the floorboard proved his failure more clearly than any inspection could. Major William Thornton commanded Camp Alva with rigid adherence to regulations. He was 48 years old, career Army, a logistics officer who had requested combat assignment and received camp management instead. He viewed POW administration as bureaucratic duty important but unglamorous, requiring meticulous attention to paperwork and protocols. Hartman brought him the medical report the following morning, laying the papers on Thornton's desk with more force than strictly necessary. "We have a serious problem," Hartman said without preamble. Thornton read through the report slowly, his expression remaining professionally neutral. When he finished, he set the papers down carefully and looked up at Hartman with eyes that showed no particular concern. "These men are receiving rations that meet Geneva Convention standards," Thornton said. "I verified this multiple times with the Red Cross. The caloric content, the nutritional composition, everything is compliant. The standards don't account for the labor these men are performing," Hartman said. "They're working 10-hour days in agricultural fields. The rations are calculated for sedentary prisoners. The discrepancy is causing malnutrition. These men are prisoners of war, Doctor. They're fortunate to receive any rations at all. These men are human beings under our care," Hartman said, his voice rising slightly. "We have a legal and moral obligation to maintain their health. The current situation violates that obligation." Thornton's expression hardened. "Are you suggesting I've violated Geneva Convention protocols?" "I'm suggesting the protocols themselves are inadequate for the circumstances. We need to increase rations for work details, or reduce the labor requirements, or both." "That's not possible." "Why not?" "Because we have contracts with local farms," Thornton said, as if explaining to a child. "Those farms are understaffed due to the draft. They need prisoner labor to maintain production. The government has agreements guaranteeing that labor. We cannot simply reduce work hours because some prisoners claim to be hungry." "They're not claiming," Hartman said flatly. They're catching rats to supplement their inadequate diet. That's how hungry they are. Thornton's eyes narrowed. They're catching rats? I found them yesterday during inspection. Living rats kept under floorboards as emergency food supply. The prisoners didn't want to report official complaints because previous requests for additional rations were denied. So they supplemented their own nutrition with vermin. That's a health violation. We should punish? We should fix the underlying problem? Hartman interrupted. Punishing desperate men for trying to survive inadequate nutrition is not the answer. Providing adequate nutrition is the answer. The two men stared at each other across the desk. The conflict between medical ethics and military efficiency made personal. Finally, Thornton said, I'll take it under advisement. That's not good enough. It will have to be, Doctor. You've made your medical recommendation. I've heard it. Now, I need to consider the broader operational implications before making any policy changes. Dismissed. Hartman left the office with rage burning in his chest like fever. He understood military hierarchy, understood that Major Thornton had final authority over camp operations. But he also understood that men were suffering unnecessarily, that his own medical expertise was being ignored for bureaucratic convenience. He needed a different approach. Hartman spent the next week building an irrefutable case. He photographed prisoners showing visible signs of malnutrition, prominent ribs, hollow cheeks, the physical evidence of bodies consuming their own muscle mass. He documented weight loss across the entire camp population, creating charts that showed disturbing trends. He compiled testimony from prisoners about their experiences, their hunger, their desperate attempts to supplement inadequate rations. Most significantly, he contacted the International Red Cross representative assigned to inspect American POW facilities. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a Swiss physician with 20 years of experience monitoring detention conditions worldwide. Müller arrived at Camp Alva on August 28, 1943. Hartman met him at the gate and spent 6 hours conducting a comprehensive tour showing him the barracks, introducing him to prisoners, presenting the medical documentation he had compiled. Muller's expression grew progressively more grave as the inspection continued. When they finished, he sat with Hartman in the medical office and spoke with diplomatic precision. This situation is unacceptable, Müller said. The prisoners are receiving technically compliant rations while performing labor that requires significantly higher caloric intake. This creates a gap that results in slow starvation. It is not a dramatic violation. No one is dying immediately, but it is a serious problem that must be addressed. Major Thornton says operational requirements prevent increasing rations, Hartman said. Major Thornton is creating conditions that violate the spirit of Geneva Convention protections, regardless of technical compliance with specific caloric minimums. Müller pulled out his own notepad and began writing. I will file a formal report with both American authorities and the International Red Cross. This report will note that while Camp Alva meets minimum nutritional standards, it fails to provide adequate nutrition for the labor being extracted from prisoners. That distinction matters legally and morally. How long before the report produces changes? Hartman asked. Officially? Perhaps weeks. Bureaucracy moves slowly. Müller looked up from his notes. Unofficially? I suggest you make Major Thornton understand that this report will reflect poorly on his command. Career officers care deeply about how their facilities are evaluated in international reviews. Sometimes the threat of documentation proves more effective than the documentation itself. Hartman returned to Major Thornton's office that evening with Dr. Muller's preliminary findings. Thornton read them silently, his face darkening with each paragraph. This is a political attack on my command, Thornton said finally. This is an accurate assessment of conditions you've allowed to develop, Hartman replied. Dr. Müller is one of the most respected neutrals in POW evaluation. His reports carry significant weight with both American authorities and international organizations. If he files this formally, your career will be significantly damaged. Are you threatening me, Doctor? I'm explaining consequences. You have an opportunity to address this problem before the formal report is filed. Increase rations for prisoners performing agricultural labor. Reduce work hours. Implement some combination of both. Make the changes necessary to ensure prisoners receive adequate nutrition for the work they're performing. Thornton was silent for a long moment, internal calculation visible in his expression. Finally, what exactly are you recommending? Hartman had prepared for this question. He pulled out a detailed proposal: increased caloric content for work details, supplemental protein portions, reduced labor hours during extreme heat, regular medical monitoring to track nutritional status. Everything backed by specific data about caloric expenditure and nutritional requirements. This will cost money, Thornton said, scanning the proposal. Less than treating widespread malnutrition-related illness. Less than dealing with an international scandal. Less than explaining to Army Command why your facility received a failing evaluation from the Red Cross. Thornton continued reading. His jaw was tight, his breathing controlled. He was a man who prided himself on running an efficient operation, and Hartman was forcing him to admit that efficiency had come at the cost of basic humanity. I'll implement this, Thornton said finally. On a trial basis, 30 days. If the cost proves prohibitive, or if productivity drops, we revisit. Agreed, Hartman said. But with one addition, I want regular weigh-ins and medical monitoring. If prisoners aren't gaining weight back within 30 days, we increase rations further. Thornton's expression showed clear distaste, but he nodded. Fine. Draft the policy changes. I'll sign them tomorrow. The new ration policy took effect on September 1, 1943. Prisoners performing agricultural labor received increased portions additional bread at breakfast, larger protein servings at dinner, supplemental snacks during afternoon work breaks. The changes weren't dramatic, perhaps 800 additional calories daily. But for men who had been slowly starving, the difference was transformative. Hartman watched the changes manifest in his weekly medical examinations. Prisoners began gaining weight steadily, a pound or two per week, their bodies rebuilding muscle mass, their faces filling out. The signs of nutritional deficiency began reversing. Dental health improved. Hair regrew thicker. The nervous symptoms of vitamin deficiency faded. More significantly, morale shifted. The prisoners had been living with constant gnawing hunger, with the knowledge that their captors either didn't recognize or didn't care about their suffering. The policy change communicated something different, that their well-being mattered, that someone was paying attention, that American treatment of POWs included actual concern for their survival beyond minimum requirements. Carl Schneider approached Hartman during an inspection 3 weeks after the policy implementation. Doctor, he said quietly, I want to thank you. For what? For seeing what we tried to hide. For understanding what the rats meant. For... Carl paused, choosing words carefully. For treating us like human beings worthy of adequate food. Hartman felt uncomfortable with gratitude for simply doing what should have been done from the start. I should have noticed earlier, he said. But you did notice, and you acted. That matters more than timing. Carl hesitated, then added, We have discussed this among ourselves. The men want you to know that this treatment, the increased rations, the medical attention, the basic respect, this changes how we think about America, about what this country represents. How so? In Germany, we were told Americans were soft, that you lacked discipline, that your concern for individual comfort made you weak. Carl's expression was thoughtful, almost meditative. But this experience teaches something different. It teaches that strength includes taking care of those in your power. That civilization means ensuring everyone receives adequate care, even your enemies. We did not expect this. It challenges what we believed. The conversation stayed with Hartman long after Carl returned to his barrack. He had entered camp medicine viewing it as administrative duty, as unglamorous but necessary work. He was beginning to understand it as something more significant. The front line in a different kind of war, The battle to prove that American values meant something concrete, that the principles America claimed to fight for could survive actual implementation. Dr. Muller's report, filed in late September, reached Army Command in Washington by mid-October. The response was swift and comprehensive. New nutritional standards were established for all POW camps, employing prisoners in agricultural labor standards that required caloric intake matched to work performed, with regular medical monitoring to ensure adequacy. Camp commanders across the country received detailed instructions about implementing these standards. Some complied readily, having already recognized the problem. Others resisted, viewing the new requirements as unnecessary burden. But the policy changes were mandatory, backed by both Army Command and International Red Cross oversight. By December 1943, malnutrition rates among working POW populations had dropped significantly. Medical reports from camps nationwide showed improved prisoner health, reduced illness rates, better outcomes when injuries occurred. The changes cost more increased food purchases, additional medical monitoring, more administrative overhead, but they produced a population of prisoners who survived their detention in significantly better condition. Major Thornton never acknowledged the policy changes as anything beyond bureaucratic adjustment. He implemented them efficiently, maintained meticulous records proving compliance, and made no public statements suggesting Camp Alva had ever operated below acceptable standards. His career continued without dramatic setback, though his command evaluations noted adequate but uninspired administration. Hartman continued his work at Camp Alva through the war's end. He conducted his inspections with increased vigilance, looking not just for obvious violations, but for subtle signs that regulations were inadequate for actual circumstances. He became known among POW medical staff as a doctor who prioritized practical outcomes over technical compliance, who understood that protecting prisoner health sometimes required challenging the regulations designed to protect prisoner health. In his personal journal, he wrote about the rats under the floorboard with particular reflection. I had been conducting inspections for weeks, checking all the proper items, verifying all the correct protocols. I believed I was doing thorough work, but I was looking at surfaces while missing the substance beneath. The prisoners were starving slowly, invisibly, and I did not see it because I was not looking for it. The rats forced me to see. They were evidence I could not rationalize away, proof that something fundamental was wrong, regardless of technical compliance with regulations. They taught me that medical care requires more than following protocols. It requires paying attention to what people actually need, not just what regulations say they should need. This seems obvious now. It was not obvious then? I needed the shock of discovery to understand my own blindness. Camp Alva closed in 1946, its prisoners repatriated to a Germany that barely resembled the nation they had left. The barracks were dismantled, the land returned to agricultural use, the whole compound erased as if it had never existed. Only photographs and official records preserved evidence that 5,000 men had spent years there, waiting for history to decide their futures. Carl Schneider returned to Hamburg after repatriation. He found his family home destroyed in bombing, his wife and daughter living with relatives in the countryside. He secured work as a mechanic, rebuilding his life from whatever pieces remained. In letters to former fellow prisoners, he occasionally mentioned Camp Alva, never complaining about the detention itself, but noting how the treatment there had shaped his understanding of what societies could be. We were enemies, he wrote to one correspondent in 1950. We had fought against American soldiers, had participated in a war that cost millions of lives. We deserved nothing beyond minimum survival. Yet when that American doctor discovered we were hungry, he fought to change the situation. Not because regulations required it, but because he believed we deserved adequate food regardless of our status as prisoners. That lesson has stayed with me as I watch Germany rebuild. The question is not whether we follow minimum standards, but whether we treat all people, even those we have power over, even those we consider enemies, with basic human dignity. The doctor in Oklahoma taught me that principle through his actions. I try to live by it now. Hartman returned to his Chicago practice after the war. He never spoke publicly about his POW camp service, viewing it as unremarkable administrative duty. But he maintained correspondence with Dr. Mueller, discussing the ongoing challenges of implementing humane detention standards, debating the gaps between regulations and reality. In a 1952 letter, Mueller wrote, "The incident at Camp Alva represented something significant in POW care, not because it revealed dramatic abuse, there were camps far worse, but because it revealed how easily good intentions can produce inadequate outcomes when we mistake compliance with regulations for actual care. The rats under the floorboard proved that prisoners were suffering despite technically adequate treatment. That insight prompted policy changes that improved conditions for thousands of men across dozens of camps. You discovered the rats, but more importantly, you understood what they meant. That capacity for insight, for seeing beyond surface compliance to underlying human need, represents the best of what medical care can achieve." The policy changes implemented after Hartman's discovery remained in effect through the war's end and influenced post-war standards for POW treatment. The principle that rations must match actual labor requirements, not just theoretical minimums, became embedded in international protocols for detention camp management. Later historians would note Camp Alva primarily as one of many facilities that housed captured Axis soldiers during World War II. The nutritional crisis there merited perhaps a footnote, if mentioned at all. But for the prisoners who experienced it, the moment when Dr. Hartman froze upon discovering their hidden rats represented something more significant. The instant when an individual chose to see what was actually happening rather than what regulations said should be happening, and then chose to act on that insight despite institutional resistance. The physical evidence of the incident disappeared completely. The floorboard was replaced. The rats were released or disposed of, records don't specify. The barrack itself was torn down in 1946, its lumber repurposed for local construction projects. Nothing tangible remained to mark where the discovery happened. But the impact persisted through changed policies and shifted understanding. In 1954, when the Geneva Conventions were being revised to incorporate lessons from World War II, American delegates referenced the Camp Alva case during discussions about nutritional standards. They argued that ration requirements should explicitly account for labor performed, that technical compliance with minimum caloric standards was insufficient if prisoners were performing work that demanded higher intake. This perspective, informed directly by Hartman's documentation, influenced the revised convention's language about prisoner treatment. The principle extended beyond POW camps. Post-war reforms in institutional care, prisons, mental hospitals, orphanages, incorporated similar logic, that minimum standards must account for actual circumstances, that compliance with regulations matters less than ensuring that people under institutional care receive what they genuinely need to survive with dignity. It was, in the end, a simple insight that hungry men catching rats to survive proved the system was failing. Regardless of what regulations said about that system's adequacy, the insight seems obvious in retrospect. Most important insights do. But in August 1943, in a POW camp in Oklahoma, it required a doctor willing to see what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. Required someone willing to understand that loose floorboards and hidden rats communicated more truth about camp conditions than all the official reports combined. Samuel Hartman died in 1967 at age 76, having practiced medicine for 47 years. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune mentioned his POW camp service in one brief sentence, noting only that he had served as camp physician during World War II. Nothing about rats or policy changes, or the moment he froze in Barrack 7. But Carl Schneider, learning of Hartman's death through veteran correspondence networks, wrote a letter to the Tribune that was published in their Letters to the Editor section. "Dr. Hartman saved my life and the lives of hundreds of other prisoners at Camp Alva, not through dramatic emergency medicine, but through paying attention when others did not. He saw that we were hungry when regulations said we were adequately fed. He changed policies to match reality rather than insisting reality conform to policies. He treated us as human beings deserving care rather than as problems to be managed. These actions seemed simple, but they were not. They required courage to challenge superior officers, integrity to prioritize patient welfare over bureaucratic convenience, and wisdom to understand that technical compliance means nothing if people are suffering. I am grateful I encountered Dr. Hartman during my detention. He taught me lessons about human decency that transcended our status as enemies. Those lessons shaped how I rebuilt my life after the war. I hope others will remember him not just as a physician, but as a man who understood that true healing requires seeing what others miss. The letter ran alongside Hartman's obituary, one small reminder that lives extend beyond official documentation. That impact can't always be measured in dramatic gestures. That sometimes the most important work happens in the space between regulations and reality, when someone chooses to pay attention to what's actually true, rather than what should theoretically be true. The rats under the floorboard weren't supposed to exist in an American POW camp. Their existence proved that something was fundamentally wrong, despite surface appearances of adequacy. Hartman's choice to understand what they revealed, and to act on that understanding despite institutional resistance, changed policy for thousands of prisoners and influenced international standards that persist today. That was the story beneath the story. Not just about hunger or rats or policy changes, but about the necessity of seeing truly, of acknowledging uncomfortable realities, of choosing to act when action is difficult but necessary. The floorboard was loose. The rats were hiding. Someone had to look beneath the surface and understand what the evidence meant. Hartman looked. He understood. He acted. That was enough.